Dear friends, I am glad to welcome everyone to the Feigen Life channel. Today is Tuesday, January 27th. The time is 21 hours, 2 minutes in Kiev, 22 hours and 2 minutes in Moscow. We are holding another stream on our channel. And, of course, as we announced it, we are holding it with Vitaly Portnikov. Vitaly, we are glad to welcome you. Hello? Well, we decided to devote this broadcast to negotiations and everything that happens around them, because we have come to the next round. As it were, Washington, Moscow, but Kiev involuntarily. And this is an occasion to talk. That's what we called the negotiations, the beginning and the end. You know, as Gumilav's son had a book like this, the end and the beginning again, and endlessly in a circle. But in any case, a request please, to our viewers before we start discussing the 3,000 who joined us. Viewers, please like. Be sure to link to this. You can post the broadcast on your social media accounts and groups. Also subscribe to the Feigen Life channel. Do it. And for Vitaly Portnikov's channel, I think it will also be very important that you follow the channel, subscribe, watch the broadcasts, and so on and so on and so on. What do you say about Abu Dhabi, Vitaly? How can this be regarded? Because what is being published, it is unclear what it is based on, trying to give some hope. You know, they had a good lunch there, or they had brunch there, they fed each other almost with a spoon. It's unclear why it's all being sold, and for what. Despite the fact that it is stated that there are no territorial issues at all. Agreement, no even prospects, even February 1st, they will gather, and the solution of the question no. Moreover, the issue of guarantees is hushed up, as if Moscow does not comment on it, as if it accepted these guarantees. What can this testimony be about? They really back down, they are ready for some kind of compromise. Or is it all a game, in order to pull out a map at some point, after the territorial issue? Which means that it concerns the security guarantee, to say, well, here we do not recognize at all. And do not have the opportunity to have a limited contingent. British-French appeared on the territory of Ukraine. How do you see it? I believe that Putin is making efforts to deter Trump from any harsh actions towards Russia. He doesn't always succeed, as we know, but it's a whole set of tricks that he uses throughout the year. This actually started from the moment of the first telephone conversation between Trump and Putin, when Putin, on the one hand, did not agree with the idea of a ceasefire proposed by Trump, but on the other hand, continued to talk about the economic cooperation, the need to find ways to solve the problem. The resumption of the Istanbul process, then a personal meeting of the presidents, then, in the end, when it became clear that the Americans were close to conducting new energy sanctions against Russia, there was, as you remember. This is the 28th, the peace plan proposed to Dmitry Vitkov. That is, it all happened. But we understand that every time, in order to give Trump the feeling that the process is moving, some new trick is needed. It is impossible to use the same ones, because Trump does not perceive the old tricks as a spectator. Remember his phrase, that we talk so pleasantly with Putin, wonderful conversations, but nothing changes, nothing moves from the spot. In other words, Trump notices these things, registers them, speaks publicly, and Putin understands that he cannot replace them with phone calls. Any new actions, because phone calls will no longer work. By the way, he invented the trick to a phone call to fire his residence. This happened exactly when Trump wanted to inform him about what they had agreed with Zelensky. But it still can't work multiple times. These are all things that can be applied once. And now, once again, we are ready for trilateral negotiations. By the way, I want to remind you that the idea of these trilateral negotiations was championed by Trump from the first day of his tenure as President of the United States. Yes, it is. Putin did not agree with that, but now agreed. Therefore, you and I need to understand, if at all possible, how far the President of the Russian Federation is ready to go. In his readiness not to create an escalation in relations with the President of the United States. That is, there will be a fork somewhere, it is already approaching, as Trump correctly says. Either Putin makes further concessions to demonstrate peacefulness. It doesn't have to be the signing of a peace treaty. I don't believe in any peace treaty at all. But it may be an energy truce, it may be some kind of withdrawal of troops in certain sectors of the front during the negotiations. Or at some specific point, he says, all the negotiations are over, the Ukrainians do not want peace. The Americans did not contribute to any real peace process, we cheated, and that his relationship with Trump interrupted. In other words, this option is always there. I understand correctly that he is ready as a last resort not to make concessions, namely to terminate these relations. But we don't know that, Mark. That's the thing, that in the end he will have to decide. Because of these tricks, as you understand, the set is limited. The fact that he went to a trilateral meeting, it already speaks about the limited set of tricks. Another important point is that he changed the composition of the delegation. In other words, he took this negotiation process much more seriously than before. Not because he wants to negotiate, but because he wants to show Vitkov and Kushner that this is a serious process. Vitkov and Kushner hardly wanted to hold trilateral talks with Medinsky because they understood perfectly well that unlike them, who have direct access to President Trump, Medinsky has a special authority in the presidential administration. Russia does not use it. And, most likely, he cannot make any decisions without calling, not even with Putin, but with the head of the Vine administration. Well, of course. With one of his first deputies, or with Kirienko the same. And the head of the main directorate of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces is a person who can, Admiral Kostyakov, make independent decisions, and only then de facto coordinate them with Putin. He understands the general line, understands what Putin really wants. He does not have, at least for today, most likely, a lack of understanding, which has always been, let's say, civilians who have failed. After all, Medinsky is not the first person who has failed with his idea that he can probably negotiate with the Ukrainians. There was Gryzlov, who, as a result of his attempts to settle the peace process, and the confidence that he could negotiate on terms comfortable for Putin, and bring him some kind of compromise with the Ukrainians on a silver platter, lost. As a permanent member of the Security Council of Russia. And here are the security forces, they have other tasks. Absolutely. Therefore, I say again, we come not to the moment of peace, but to the moment of exhaustion of tricks at some point. And this is the main formula, which, it seems to me, exists, that Putin is driven not by the desire to establish peace, but by the desire to prevent the escalation of Russian-American relations, because he needs Trump, and he needs one more thing. He needs to sit out Trump without escalating with Trump. I think that, in principle, the whole maneuver was designed to last until 2029. But it won't work, because it's a long time, especially in the current one. The military situation, in the current economic situation of Russia itself. And so I'm not going to say that we are close to peace there. I will say that we are close to a fork in the road. That is, well, okay, you say we don't know, but still in the plan. The situation is as if it is now. This fork has come, not somewhere there closer to spring, let's say, but now it would have come. Putin would be with all the kit he has now. Problems in the economy, lack of humanity, human resource. There is definitely a deficit already. If he packs 35, then it means thousands, then you agree, but even if 50 or 70, it's still a deficit. Because there is so much to pack, it even becomes problematic to replenish, because, well, it means the prospect of a decline. What fork would he choose now? That's what, in your opinion, as it seems to you, I think he would have made partial concessions. On a partial concession it would be. This already suggests that, in principle, there is an option of partial concessions. That is why they want to destroy the Ukrainian energy sector, so that if they have to conclude an energy truce, Ukrainians did not have the opportunity to restore it before its completion. This is not a random blow, these are blows that imply the possibility of some concessions. An energy truce suggests itself against the background of the fact that everyone sees that Putin really wants to organize v. Ukraine has a real energy catastrophe. Well, yes, of course, obviously. That's why he wants even before such a concession can be claimed. I don't think it is in demand now, but it can be in demand to bring the energy system of Ukraine to a state that would require a lot of money. Terms for its restoration. But at the same time, will spread rumors that Putin is ready for the money to restore it. Let only will give the Donbass, and we will Rhine-Shu energy. You see, after all this is absolutely logical, what is happening in all respects. If we reduce the history of the Russian-Ukrainian war to the fact that Ukrainian troops must leave the unoccupied territory of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, And it seems that not only Russians, but also Americans are talking about this. This raises the question, what was all this for? 4 years of the Great War. Huge human sacrifices. I'm talking about Russia right now. From Russia. Huge sanctions, huge economic losses that are unlikely to be restored in the coming years. Practically the collapse of economic ties with the West, the loss of Russia and its place as an energy, I would say, sponsor of the West, and the country, which, in fact, is the main gas hub for Europe, in favor. Almost 100% of Russia's economic dependence on China. For what? To get Slavyansk-Kramatorsk. It's crazy, you know, the price-quality ratio is 0. That's why I ask the question, is it really for Putin to establish control over part of the territory of Donetsk and Lugansk? The area is a priority. I can understand the Ukrainian position when the citizens of Ukraine do not want to give up this territory without a fight, because it is the territory of their country. They believe that territorial integrity is important. They do not want to let Russian troops into the fortified areas of Donbass. This is understandable. But when Putin says he is ready to end the war solely for the sake of the occupation of the territory of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, it is necessary to clearly recognize that this obchina not worth the candle. Therefore, I do not really understand what is happening, because if I were in Putin's place from the point of view of logic, I certainly would not consider that this is a sufficient payment. For the 4 years that Russia spent in the Great War against Ukraine, I'd be thinking of something else. I would probably think in this situation that, perhaps, the very thesis of the occupation of the entire territory of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Russia could lead to destabilization of the situation in Ukraine itself. It can lead to the collapse of the Ukrainian army, thus helping the Russian Federation to occupy at least all the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine, reach the Dnieper, and create an immediate threat to Kiev from the other bank of the Dnieper. But here the question arises, and if Putin's calculation does not come true in this case either, there will be no destabilization of the situation. Do you understand? Even if we assume that the Ukrainian leadership would have agreed with some scheme of withdrawal of Ukrainian troops in the Donetsk region, but the Ukrainian society took and did not react. It doesn't always have to react the way Putin wants. Or, as it seems to us, from the point of view of the paradigma of the development of events, it did not react. No one moved anywhere else. Ukrainian troops were able to gain a foothold on the administrative borders of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. What to do next? End the war. Or to say, we were joking, we didn't need it. Look, Vitaly, I said this, that the territorial issue, yes, everyone is discussing it, but the security guarantees that are agreed between Washington, Europe and Kiev as a whole, they somehow go sideways. In any case, Ushakov does not speak publicly about them. For example, in contrast to the territorial issue, what does this mean? Does this mean that, in principle, they are ready to the point that the British and French will appear on the territory of Ukraine? Well, we don't know at all to what extent there are any contingents in these security guarantees. No, they definitely are, in any case. I do not know if these security guarantees will be included in the peace treaty. You see, when they agree, if there is a compromise in this, that yes, everything is over, both America and Europe insist on this, so that the contingents are on the territory of Ukraine. Look you, I think the formula is not very notice. The idea of withdrawing troops from the Donetsk region is the idea of the possibility of the beginning of the peace process, not the end. There can be no ceasefire until the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the territory of the Donetsk region. But if they leave, we can already talk. It's a gesture of trust. But this is the air trade. This donut hole from vest sleeves. I am almost sure that if some kind of peace treaty is concluded between Russia and Ukraine, it will be real. And, by the way, today the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Andriy Sevagov, explained that this will be an agreement on the principle of a grain deal. Have you seen it? The USA and Ukraine conclude a separate agreement between the USA and Russia. In other words, there will be no peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine. Therefore, it is not necessary to talk about any termination of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Even in the case of a real continuation of this process, no one even lays down the scheme. Termination of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Our viewers, citizens of Ukraine in general, should clearly understand this. There will be no peace treaty, as there is no peace treaty between Israel and Hamas. And there is no peace. There is a Trump plan, in fact, involving American mediation. But it is initialed, so to speak, by the Hamas side and initialed exactly by Israel. We can also initialize this agreement with the Verkhovna Rada and the State Duma, but it will still be an agreement, not between us, But the United States. This is completely different. The procedure, but why will there be such a situation? The absence of peace will be a dilution. You see, in the sense that they will end separately with the Americans. Ukrainians are Americans. And the war will continue after the liberation of the territory of Donbass. Well, the Donetsk region is not an occupied part. No, it may stop at some stage, but there will be no guarantees that it will not resume. Because Russia has not promised Ukraine anything. She promised America. And no one knows how Russian-American relations will develop after that. But there is another very important point. We don't know what will be recorded as a result of these separate agreements. In other words, I do not think that there will be any point in the agreement between the Russian Federation and the United States that presupposes the presence of NATO member countries on the territory of Ukraine, because it contradicts common sense. On the one hand, the United States guarantees Russia that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. Let it not even be in this agreement, but it will be clearly declared by Presidents Putin and Trump, and it has already been declared more than once. And on the other hand, the United States provides some kind of agreement, which, by the way, can still be, like the agreement on gas, ratified by the UN Security Council, not only by parliaments, that the troops of NATO member states, that is, troops from the point of view of Russian ideology, objectively posing a threat to Russia's national security, will enter the territory of Ukraine. Therefore, I assure you, this will not happen in the peace agreements. This does not mean that these troops will not be there. This means that NATO member countries will need to take risks, lead their contingents, realizing that they can become a target for the armed forces of the Russian Federation at any moment, and that in the event of a resumption of the Russian-Ukrainian war, for example, after Donald Trump leaves the post of President of the United States, British and French soldiers can die, for example, after the first bombing of the new Ukraine. Because I'm sure this first bombing will be directed primarily to the British and French barracks. Putin will fight with NATO on Ukrainian soil. This is one of the best options that exist for him politically. Therefore, they will either take a risk, or they will not take a risk. So, we have 15,000 spectators watching, and almost 3.5 thousand like it ether. Accordingly, please once again, we have been on the air for about 18 minutes. Post links to this broadcast in your social media accounts in groups. Be sure to like it. Well, if you advance us with Vitaly in this way, it means that you will help this ether in the recommended conditions. And, of course, subscribe again to the Feigen Life channel and the Vitaly Portnikov channel. There is a link to it in the description of this video. There too, by the way, there is a broadcast. I want to say that I do not rule out, that the West itself can move away from some of its principled proposals. By the way, this is how it is, by the way, as with the Russian platform in the past. Here I have seen the composition of this platform. Congratulations on turning it on. I accept congratulations so sluggishly. Well, I'm sluggish, and congratulations, I'm sluggish, congratulations, you sluggishly respond. But how did it happen that there are people in this group who, in my opinion, did not accept this Berlin Declaration, or did? No. Everyone who got into the platform signed it. Yes, there were people who ran, but for some reason did not sign it. This is Ekaterina Shulman, she didn't sign it, and everyone is wondering why it didn't pass. It was necessary to sign the declaration, well, that is, the Berlin Declaration. And then it turns out that the people who spoke about their disagreement with the Berlin Declaration, that this Khodorkovsky Declaration, called it various other epithets, when it came to their inclusion in the list, they signed it after all. It was a foursome firm, the Free Rush Foundation. They signed it, but in advance it happened before January 5th, when the submission of applications ended. They formally met all the criteria. And the same Vladimir Karmers signed, there are a number of others, so there are no questions for them. But those who did not sign and were candidates, they could not simply be made members of the platform, participants of the platform, simply because they did not fulfill the conditions stipulated by the resolutions on their son. I fully admit that the people who submitted their candidacies without signing this declaration, they did not expect to be part of the platform, but made some kind of image step, demonstrating that they really want to protect the interests of their Russian compatriots, but to this day they were not allowed there. They let in some other people who are now being ridiculed, so to speak, by Russian propagandists of various types from Skobiva to Latinina. Is it possible to do this? Well, to Latinin, this is a lost copy. But I don't hear, Skobiva is no better, she is even worse. But simply Putin's propaganda should not be taken into account. Although I want to tell the audience, I am in Strasbourg right now, we are already starting meetings. I want to tell you that the Kremlin is hammering without ceasing. And not only through the Skobivs, but also through Yulia Leonidovna. Threshing, be healthy. That is, that all should understand, everything flows, what you think some independent opinion, we already know. We already have information from Ukrainian friends, on the other, that's all purposeful anti-comnia. So don't get too fooled. Well, I'm sorry for interrupting. No, I was just going to ask. No, Volodya in full, they are not satisfied. A rare part of the people who have joined this platform are quite respectable people with different views. Yes, of course, we may have complaints against Volodya, Kara-Murza, in connection with those theses that have been repeatedly made. I would say, but his very life position deserves only respect. No one doubts the respect for Vladimir Kara-Murza. For example, I do not agree with a certain line that is held by the political, but this is a discussion. This is the subject of discussion. Why don't we have a discussion? We will discuss it. But I want to say that the Kremlin is even more attentive to this than we expected. And today, for example, they, please, don't even have to go far, finally announced that he has news about Khodorkovsky. He was charged, the whole set is already with an increasing degree, a member of the mantle. The military committee that passed in the platform, they are the defendants in this case. Why was it necessary to make this public today, the day after the announcement of the composition of this platform? Well, these are interrelated things, of course. It's just that people would like to nightmare European MPS. Still see, you mean, of course. Soon we will announce those things bring. We'll announce the cases, and we'll kill someone, they're already up to this. Everything is there, everything is the whole set, so that no one has any illusions. But going back to what we are, by the way, in my program, the question of Ukraine is the main one. That is, I would like to Ukrainian agenda, and a number of others there, Garry Kasparev and so on. But I think most will have to be in it. For us, the peace talks, what accompanies them, and what is derived from them, is the main item on the agenda. That's why we're discussing this. There is nothing more important for us than this. After all, as it seems to you, the role of turns. At first it was exclusive, now he has been given the capture of Kushner for this last month and a half. There are already some new characters appearing there. Where is it all going? Here, the shuttle functionality of the turns gives the same dynamics. Or at some point, it will have to be changed completely. But it seems to me that as long as Putin makes these limited concessions, let's say, of a procedural nature, it means he gives. Some other figure may appear only if the situation freezes. And so Trump, in principle, can be satisfied. We went to Moscow with Kushner and trilateral negotiations began. What else do you want from the wits? What can he do? He can't stop the war alone. He may seek new concessions from Putin in some way. So far it is effective. Especially what you see. After all, in fact, the role of Withoff, if we talk about. Quite seriously. This is the role of a member of the Politburo of the CPSU Central Committee. He is a member of the Executive Committee of the Peace Council. And as a member of the Executive Committee of the Peace Council, he is responsible for resolving crisis issues, not only in Ukraine. He negotiated. In the Middle East, yes. In the East in Ukraine. And he is still now, so I realized, there was still some kind of mission, now the third one. In Iran, for some reason, yes, with the Iranians. Yes, he was filming with the minister, he tried somewhere there, yes. And continues. That is, it constantly at all critical moments. Let's just say it's Trump's shuttle foreign minister. There is the Secretary of State of the United States, and there is the foreign minister of the Peace Council. But it turns out that it is ineffective. You see, Vitaly, he is ineffective, judging by the result. Not about the process, but about the result. To you, yes, judging by Trump's result, no. But there is an objective reality, you can't cancel it. Cancel it. Trump can cancel objective reality. He is the President of the United States. Well, how to do this with negotiations with Putin? How will you do it if there is no result? By increasing pressure on Putin in this case, for example, by conducting new sanctions, by the way. No turns prevented Trump from conducting sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil. Again, returning to Trump may not want to see reality, but he is forced to react to it every time. As in the case of Minnesota, for example. This is a vivid example. First, the protection of migration service employees after the second murder in this state, and then the words that migration services can leave the state. This suggests that Trump, in principle, is not a person who does not notice. The reality is like that. He may not notice reality until that reality knocks on the door. In Beethoven's way, there is a clear signal when fate knocks at the door. That's when we hear ta-ta-ta there, Trump immediately reacts. And while there is no this blow, he lives in the reality that he is comfortable with, This is quite normal for Trump. That's who he is. Yes, but he is heading for such an intermediate collapse because it all leads to not only this, and not primarily this, but to the November elections and to the outcome. I mean in this 26th year. I'm not going to argue with that. But I would like to remind you that you prove it to me like this. It's like I'm Trump, and you can't be Trump. I'm just saying that he has a certain distance to which he has to show efficiency. Well, of course, not only in the question of Ukraine, of course, which part of the voters is affected, but also on other issues. And he's like that in general. It seems that he is really internally convinced that everything is in his favor. And in general, he threatens disaster. You know how it goes. From the Paleoactive Center, it means that he leaves the hospice at the 4th stage and says, but everything is fine. The main thing is not to notice and simply go home and do his job. I did not simplify the situation again, because I know, because I see, that Trump is forced to notice the reality of an irreversible nature, but he can always count on the fact that he will achieve a certain turn in his favor. When he realizes that this is no longer possible, he acts differently. And sanctions against Russia, he didn't want to drive them, you know. He didn't want to drive the new sanctions. But he realized that without a signal of pressure on Putin, there would be nothing at all. There won't be anything at all. This is one example. Another example is what is happening with Minnesota. What is happening with the tariffs? Do you remember this magnificent speech in the Rose Garden of the White House on the day of the liberation of America? I would like to ask, what is going on with tariffs in general? They are, in fact, a rejection of the economic war with China, again, a truce until November. An understanding that Xi Jinping can lead the American economy to such consequences with one hand, which will generally put an end to the by-elections for Republicans in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. Therefore, there is no desire to aggravate the relationship. Therefore, I do not think that Trump can be accused of a complete lack of realism. I believe that he can be suspected of unwillingness to see reality. But unwillingness and impossibility are the same thing. So we can say with you that Trump cannot see reality. No, I don't think it can. He's capable, he doesn't want to. This is in many ways, you know, such child psychology. The child very often does not want to notice reality. But he is forced to reckon with her when she's just a factual way it comes. Yeah. Well, we already have 18.5 thousand watching. A little announcement so as not to forget it. Allow more time towards the end of the program. Do you remember that if you have problems, especially for the Russian audience, they only widen? These problems with access to the internet, to social networks and so on, to everything that we call information exchange. As well as messengers, a way to communicate. Here please, Feigen VPN is in front of you time after time. Every day we advertise it so that you remember that there is such a tool for overcoming your problems. Many complain, right, but there is no other way. It just doesn't exist right now. If the internet cancels, well, it will be a different conversation. But until today, you can very simple to solve this problem. Subscribe to Feigen VPN via Telegram bot. Feigen VPN bot. There is a link here in your chat, or through the site on the site that is in the description of this video. There is a link feigenlife.net. You can subscribe. If you have cards with access to the Visa MasterCard payment system, foreign cards, not Russian, I recommend subscribing for a year, so that you pay once and forget about everything about it and use it freely. Remember that the caliper works, as they say, 24/7. If you have something wrong, something has some problems, and this may occur. Russian regulators are certainly chasing our VPN. You can write there, and they will always help you figure it out, do it, solve it, and so on. So don't forget that this is a friendly attitude first of all. Such friendliness, it's very important. Well, and we continue. Okay, then let's go in from the other end. Let's talk about reality for the Russian Kremlin. After all, they have not even achieved intermediate goals. Today Gerasim declares that he took the nodal one, which means that Kapinsk is nodal. I have been there, by the way, an important point, a locality. Disputes are going on, so it is or not so. Although in Kapinsk itself, which I also visited, there in the center of the city, there is a feeling that, yes, this is a semi-gray zone. But nevertheless it is definitely not controlled by Russian troops. It was clearly an exaggeration to say that Putin was taken, and so on. None of this is happening now. But it turns out that the military authorities, who report to Putin, are also struggling with this reality. Apparently, Putin himself, in order to constantly show him that we are advancing, there are so many settlements. 500 square kilometers. Years and so on, that is, he needs to constantly maintain this dangerous illusion, which he uses as an instrument of pressure on the American side, on the Europeans. But it is useless for Ukrainians to put pressure on it. Which means, that's it, if you don't agree, we'll take everything anyway. And this is not happening. Do you understand? Here he promises time after time, like the horizon line. She moves away, and nothing happens. He does not take Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, or Konstantinovka. Maybe, theoretically, he will take a constant conversation, but still someday, but it's someday as far away. As it seemed that Pokrovsk would be taken in not 14 or 15 months, but much earlier. What is Putin doing with this reality? How does he manage to continue selling in the form of air what it means that we will achieve all our goals militarily? Although this does not happen. That's what. Look, it is very important for Putin to support this idea for one simple reason. He wants to say that he is doing Trump a favor with his peace talks. In fact, I don't want any peace negotiations. I'm going to take over this whole Ukraine sooner or later anyway. But because I respect you, I'm ready to stop if they even come to their senses. After all, is because they can't make up your mind, do not understand that they are just our satellite. As soon as they realize that they are our satellite, everything will end right away. And if they don't want to, then I will achieve all this by military means. I just respect you. Persuade them to come to their senses at all. With this, it performs another function. Gives Trump the opportunity to tell Ukrainians that they should agree, because he will take it all anyway. And you see, he's going forward. But the truth is that all of this really exists exclusively in the fantasies of the chief of the general staff of the Russian armed forces. And Putin himself. Because we see that the American intelligence services, apparently, do not provide Trump with the information that Putin provides him. Trump constantly has to refer to Putin. By the way, exactly the same story with Valdai happened when Trump talked with Putin. And he said that he had escalated his residences on Valdai. Putin first got angry, outraged, Trump, and then admitted that none of this happened. Well, that is, it's not just the creation of an alternative reality. This is the creation of an alternative reality for Trump personally, so that it would be easier for him to put pressure on Kiev. That's it. Putin himself is aware that the situation is not so brilliant at all, or he too is in some illusions, in the feeling that, well, yes, it's not so fast, but it's still guaranteed in the foreseeable future. I think Putin is under the illusion that his main ally is time. And if he had not been under the illusion that the main solution after the Blitzkrieg is a long-term war of attrition, he would have ended the war after the Blitzkrieg. By the way, as we understand it, he had such opportunities. And he, most likely, would have fixed for himself quite large territorial acquisitions without any United States. But when Putin says that this Ukraine has not initialed the agreements reached by Medinsky, it's not true. Well, of course. Because these agreements were, first of all, exclusively by step in order to smoothly go from Blitzkrieg to the war of attrition. And secondly, when Medinsky returned from Istanbul and made these agreements public, all the dogs were unleashed on these agreements. And on Medinsky himself, including Solovyev, who talked about betrayal, that it was impossible to do this. In other words, no one in Russia. This is also another illusion that the Russians are successfully exploiting. And that many are trying to repeat even in Ukraine. The Russian leadership had no real intentions to end the war in 2022. There was an idea of switching from Blitzkrieg to a multi-year war of attrition. And by the way, the intelligence services of these Western countries also knew this, because already in March 2022, a lot of people, Western experts, who were influencers there, from the point of view of contact with their politicians and representatives of the intelligence community, they said very clearly that the war in Ukraine in terms of timing and consequences would be similar to the war in Syria. That is, it was initially laid for 7-8 years, but only 4 years have passed. Therefore, no one had any illusions in the West that Putin was ready to end the war in 2022 either. But nevertheless, I say again, this is Putin's idea that yes, in 4 years, we will not be able to. 8 we can. But Putin has, I would say, serious opponents here. The first is the resources of Russia, and the second is his own age. How old is he? 74 this year. Well, that means another 5-6 years of war, he will approach the 80th anniversary. This means that there are no other plans except for the conquest of Ukraine, even if we assume that it cannot be. In other words, the mistake of 1991 will never be corrected, so to speak, in the language of KGBists. The Soviet Union will never arise. Russia will never be a geopolitical player again. China is ready to let it down the geopolitical toilet, even without the United States. During these 4 years, the Russian Federation has become an economic and political protectorate of the People's Republic of China, dependent on Beijing, since it has not depended on anyone since the Golden Horde. Yes, it's generally obvious. This weakening Russia will always be a food and not a predator. That is, it will always take the last place in this food chain. She is already essentially a ram pretending to be a tiger, having the opportunity, so to speak, just to torment the one who is weaker. Well, of course. For each lamb, there is a conditional kitten, which she knows like this. Yes, Ukraine is defending itself, but it has fewer people, fewer resources. It's less have to rely on the support of the West, but it's still incomparable value. Although for China, Russia is no longer a tiger dragon, despite all its nuclear potential. Because no nuclear potential can replace economic impotence, which, in fact, has become the essence of the Russian economy. We don't sell oil, we don't live. So, there are already 21,000 of us watching, and we have been on the air for almost 7 minutes. We still have time. Then let's go in. That's another side. Like this. We have discussed this and devoted a lot to both Venezuela and Iran. And now we can compare the Venezuelan story, which ended with the arrest and removal of Maduro. And we can already see the consequences of this, that oil really stopped flowing in those streams. Wherever she was headed before premature, yes, despite the fact that the regime has not changed. There are some cosmetic changes going on with the political prisoner, but so far nothing portends profound changes. I completely agree. But oil is still really the United States, or by agreement directly with the Venezuelan authorities themselves, this is the family. Or it means, under certain pressure, well, no matter how the fleet or everything else goes anywhere, neither to Cuba, nor in connection with China, nor there towards Russia, or with the presence of Russia, it does not go. There is some consequence here. As for Iran, yes. Well, we remember, we discussed in detail. The promise didn't end with anything. On the other hand, now pulls the navy and so on. That's as far as one can judge how scared Putin was after the Maduro operation. I'm conditionally, of course, so to speak, scared. Yes, maybe literally, but as you will see. And how excited he is when something has not happened in connection with Iran. Well, after all, these are, yes, allies, maybe in some practical way. The same Iran is there, although, again, they are already coping without Iran in terms of military supplies and so on. But here is this inner feeling that I am not alone, and that somewhere else there is someone in this queue behind me. Or ahead of me. It also gives some sense of confidence that it's not coming for you with a scythe. I am absolutely sure that Putin does not perceive himself in this way at all. He perceives himself in the picture of the world in which Trump exists. There are leaders of great powers who are untouchable in themselves, who are leaders. These leaders may have their own vassals, but there is absolutely no need to apply the same arching to them as to vassals. Here there is Trump, Putin, and Xi Jinping. What happens with Maduro, with Zelensky, with Ayatollah Khamenei, with Macron and Scholz, no one should be interested. If one of the leaders of the great powers decides that he needs to eliminate some, so to speak, the average head of state, or kidnap him, as they say, or kill him, and another leader of a great power cannot provide sufficient assistance to his ally, this is unpleasant for the leader of the power that contained an ally or supported an ally, but this does not apply in any way personally to the leader of a great power. And, by the way, the same status of Putin is largely defended by Trump. Because when Trump was outraged in connection with the shelling of Putin's residence on Valday, it was exactly of this order of indignation. After all, it would seem, but what's the big deal? Sorry, Russia has repeatedly hit on. The cabinet of ministers of Ukraine, the Verkhovna Rada, Bankova, struck at the residence where Zelensky was. In 2022, direct measures were generally taken to destroy the Ukrainian leadership. It's good to remember that. But in Trump's eyes, What Putin is doing to Zelensky may be wrong. The right decision to be felt for this is the decision of the leader of a great power in relation to a person who cannot even compete in weight. And Putin has exactly the same feeling. Yes, it's bad that Trump kidnapped Maduro. Yes, it's bad that Maduro will be in court. Yes, it's bad that Russia is losing influence in Venezuela. But Maduro himself, he is in general nobody, and there is no way to call him like Bashar is. Because it's Russia, the United States and China that decide where to rule. Yes, the United States has outplayed us here now. We'll beat them somewhere there too. Don't get into our sphere of influence. The idea is this: you are climbing into our sphere of influence. Yes, Yanukovych is our puppet, but don't put your puppets. We don't need Gazdap cookies. We don't actively meddle with your puppets, and you don't meddle with ours. Therefore, I think that Putin feels absolutely calm, as the leader of a great power in his eyes, when someone is arrested for him. Those who are not taken seriously as equals. Another thing is that this is an invented sense of self. Trump may not treat Putin like that, but he still does. That's it. And I say again, I think that all this reaction with the shelling of the residence, she emphasized it because it was, like the shelling of Olympus. A mortal should not raise his eyes to Olympus, where Zeus is with the gods. Yes, it is clear that Putin is not Zeus, but he is some kind of Ares or Hercules. Mortals shouldn't go where the gods are. 3. Well, maybe 3.5. We need to understand who else Trump is there. It seems to me that he doesn't list anyone else. On Rendra, he doesn't consider mine equal either, does he? Well, he doesn't consider it equal, but I have to admit the scale. I have to take into account the scale, but nevertheless I am ready to put pressure on him, to introduce a tariff. Threaten him. Xi Jinping does not strain such logic. By the way, we can trace this even by the level of communication that Trump chooses for certain leaders. As you notice in the story, Xi Jinping and Putin never even anything similar. With elements of the show. Serious conversations of adults, games of the gods. And if Zelensky or Ramaphosa, you can openly make fun of them in your own office. Because they're really nobody. Someone is Putin and Xi Jinping. One has a huge amount of nuclear weapons, the other has an economy. And there is also a certain amount of nuclear weapons there. And everyone else, well, you see, he allows himself to speak disparagingly about Macron. And Narendra fashion also raises a question for him. They say, here he is financing the war. Putin and Xi Jinping does not finance. Why don't they tell him that? Out loud. Well, I can give a great many such examples. Therefore, no, Putin is not worried about his fate, as long as Trump perceives him this way. For the fact that the Iranian regime will fall, and that he has it. There will be no allies, he is worried. But the fact that no one will come after him after that, he is absolutely sure of this in his picture of the world. But I repeat again, this picture of Putin's world is identical to the picture of Trump's world. For now, at least. Clearly. Well, we've been on the air for 43 minutes. The latter literally. Question, rounding off the topic, still reviewing this near future, these negotiations will resume on February 1st. Why else should you understand? I'm here in Strasbourg, and I've been to a lot of places before, and it's, like, floating around, which is still possible. It is possible to negotiate peace. In Europe, it's even being discussed, as it were, what will happen after the peace agreement. We're going to be here somehow, here, there. Wait, a little bit, just about. For example, I don't see it. I don't see it either. But here I still admit that there may be some new concessions from Russia. It's a matter of scale. In other words, we can still see something on February 1st, or March 1st, or June 1st. We can see something on a limited scale. If Trump presses harder, we can see it on a larger scale. There will be less pressure, we will see it on a smaller scale. You understand that Putin still remains a hostage to the perception of the world as a world by force. No, well then, we will wait for the near future in order to see how the situation develops. We have been on the air for 45 minutes, 22.5 thousand are watching us right now. 6.5 thousand have put their likes. First of all, we thank all the viewers for joining us. I'm a bit in the field, I'm in Strasbourg. Here, I have business here. And, accordingly, tomorrow we will also have a broadcast. Don't miss the broadcast. We thank Vitaly Portnikov. Thank you for kindly agreeing to come to us. And finally, subscribe to our channel. the Feigen Life channel, and the channel of Vitaly Portnikov in the description of this video. There is a link on the channel of Vitaly Portnikov. You can watch the broadcast there.